Hello, and welcome to the Off the Fence podcast. This is a podcast where we deconstruct difficult decision making to try to figure out what keeps us stuck, but more importantly, how do we get unstuck? I'm your host, Karen Covey, a former divorce lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator, turned coach, author, and entrepreneur. This is a very special episode of the Off the Fence podcast. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this for almost 2 years, but we have. And in this podcast, what you're going to get is the very best of the interviews that we've done in 2024. So you're going to get little snippets of interviews on how to divorce a narcissist, how to mediate your divorce, how to navigate a sexless marriage, and how to do bird nesting, and so much more. So all of the full episodes will be linked below the video or below the audio in the show notes, wherever you happen to be listening or watching. And I really hope you enjoy this episode as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Thank you for all of your support throughout the year. I really appreciate your watching, your listening, and most importantly, your subscribing and sharing. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. Right now, we're going to hear from Tracy Malone, an international divorce coach, narcissist abuse survival coach, author, speaker, educator, victim, and survivor of narcissistic abuse. And Tracy's going to talk about how to divorce a narcissist. For those people who don't know you, with your story, why did you get into this particular area of work?
Well, it wasn't an intentional, like, hey, let me just go work on not people being abused. Obviously, you can see the word above my head. I am a survivor. I had a pretty horrific divorce, and I started a support group after that, and I needed it for me. I was like, help me, bring people together. And, again, accidental career. And that grew to, 60 people a month I was working with. And again, I'm just there, but I wanted to teach them. I'm like, we can't just come and whine. We have to heal. So I would teach them and then grow and grow. And then I built my website, my YouTube, and the rest is history. My book is also, on divorcing a narcissist. So it became sort of the platform that took me into the next level as well.
So how did you, I want to take us to very basics. How
Mhm.
did you know you were divorcing a narcissist per se? And maybe we start with, what is a narcissist?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I didn't know I was divorcing a narcissist through the entire year, 7 trials. Nobody, not my therapist, not my lawyers, not the mediator, nobody ever said it. And so it was just called the most horrific, well, actually was the most contentious divorce in our town's history by the judge. I was like, well, that's an accomplishment, but no one said the word. So I didn't know. And I didn't know because I found out later after I dated the next one and then learned I had really didn't know what it was because I grew up with narcissistic family members, both parents and siblings. So it was very familiar to me. Ghosting was our family vacation, right? So let's get into what an actual definition of a narcissist is because, we have a thing called the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which tells us, hey, if you're trying to diagnose someone, here's the things that define them, right? And they're, in my opinion, they don't really reflect it. So it's sort of a grandiose sense of importance. They exaggerate their achievements. These are all minor little things. They believe they're special and they required extra admiration and validation, and they have a sense of entitlement. That's not the truth. I mean, those happen, yes, but they manipulate people, they lie, they steal, they hurt people, they gaslight people endlessly. They charm as the first weapon to kind of get people into their life. But in the end, they are, really destroying people's lives for their own gain. They don't care who they step on, who they hurt, how many years you've been married. I've had a client that was married for 50 years. And you would think after 50 years, just give her the money and have a nice day. No, it's still a 4-year battle and over $4 million. And like, again, a normal person would be like, okay, we don't get along anymore. Let's just, here's your half, here's my half, have a nice life, right? It is a battle. It is a war. And if you've got children, unfortunately, they use the children as weapons without any like empathy for what they're doing. They just want to get you. The revenge just sits into their heart and they are evil. Evil's a very good word for them. I like that better than the DSM-5 things.
Well, I know that one of the hallmark characteristics of narcissist is that lack of empathy, right? But all the things you described can also describe a lot of people going through a divorce. So, how do you differentiate between somebody who's going through a divorce and is just angry and like, does that make them a narcissist? Versus someone who really rises to that level that it sounds like you're describing of what's a narcissist. How does someone know if their spouse is really a narcissist or it's just, they're angry and upset about the divorce and so they're not being their best self?
Right. And again, you're absolutely right. Divorce makes people get defensive and fight for things. And this is common behavior to expect it, right? It's when they've been doing it all along. When they've had four different wives at the same time, when they've got four different girlfriends at the same time, when they are, manipulating and hiding money like this 50-year guy, he's been hiding money for 30 years, like just secret accounts and this and that. It's not just in the divorce. This has been consistent, this abuse and, putting people down and making them feel like they can never do enough. And you try harder. That's how they get the victims to do more. This has been their life. Their legacy is they just can't do anything right. They do it all. I'll give you that. They'll give 99.9% of everything, and it's still not enough. And then there's the cycle of abuse, which is sort of idealize, devalue, discard. So the idealize in the beginning of a relationship is like love bombing. Everyone hears that word all the time, right? But that cycle continues through the relationship. It's when they're in the nice mood, I call it, right? You have times where, oh my God, they're nice. We had a good Christmas. Oh, that was great. And normally they ruin all holidays, but that's another story. But there's these periods where that's the person I love. That's the one I fell in love with. And we can excuse away all the bad behavior. They're having a bad week. They're hangry. They're angry. They're hungry. They didn't get the promotion. They're so sad. So therefore it's okay to abuse someone. Right? That's the difference is it's not just during the divorce. This has been happening and the victims have been tolerating it and then almost dangling that nice guy, nice girl person going, okay, I'll hold out for them. I can excuse all these bad things. And then it reaches a point where you go, it's never stopping.
Yeah. So I'd like to dive into that a little bit more too, because it sounds like what you're describing is that it's not an isolated incident. There's a pattern of behavior that happens over and over and over again. And let's get into that. You said the first part of that pattern, the first step in the cycle is the love bombing, the adoration, the nice person, the whatever. Say more about that. And I know, because I've worked in this area myself too, that's the point where they suck people in. That's where they hook their potential partner, spouse, what have you. But what comes after that charming, sweet, nice person? What's the next step in the cycle?
The next step is the devalue stage. And again, this is not only in the beginning, but over and over. So, but they get the nice guy, then all of a sudden, you loaded the dishwasher wrong. You did that wrong. Pick, 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 right? They're starting to devalue you. Why did you make that decision? That was dumb. Sort of little tiny pokes through the nice guy, nice girl act, right? All of a sudden, you can't do anything right. That's the devalue. They put people down. Some of them are verbal and really, tell people terrible things about them. Others are covert. They're a little bit more passive aggressive in this stage where it's subtle. So you can't say they hit you, they punched you, they did this. But it's ongoing. It's making you feel small. It's controlling you. It's not letting you see your friends. It's not letting you see your family. It's not letting you see male friends. If you're the female, don't ever see your male friends. It's control comes into that devaluing stage. You're doing it wrong. Let's fix this, right? So that comes into that devalue stage, and it's a dangerous part.
Yeah, it seems like it would be hard to pick up on, especially if you're in the stage where you love someone and it would be confusing, but you don't know what to do with it. right?
And also they select victims, targets we call us. Supply is another word. They select them based on what kind of supply they will be. They look for a certain kind of person that is often codependent, so they're people pleasing. They'll take on the guilt and the shame, going, "Oh, you're right, I should have tried harder." They'll if they get yelled at by the narcissist, they will internalize it because perhaps they've had abuse in their past and it's normal, right? Just like for me, I was like, oh, okay, ghosting, it's my family vacation, they'll be back, right? That's because I was groomed that way. So they hear your story, they know you had another bad relationship, they swear to God they would never cheat because their spouse cheated on them and they would be so loyal and oh, so you believe those lies, right? And you get hooked into it. And so the danger lies in that, not recognizing the devalue stage, because again, it could be subtle. It's just, okay, you did the dishwasher wrong, you didn't do this right, why'd you do that, what money are you spending? Little tiny things that are normal relationship conversations, but they're really designed to make you feel horrible and to take away that power so that you're fighting for that good person to come back.
Right. You want the person you married, right?
Try harder.
Yeah. So after that devalue stage, which at that point the other person in the relationship has got to feel pretty awful, right?
Mhm.
After that, what's the next stage in the cycle?
The last stage is the discard, is what it's called. But it doesn't mean like I'm getting a divorce, goodbye. That's the final discard, of course. But the other discard things are the silent treatment, the pouting, I'll get you, the anger, the fighting, the throwing things, the hitting if that comes into it, right? So there's lots of things that can happen in that discard stage. But again, what happens with the codependent, empathic, people-pleasing people that they're doing this to, we feel terrible. We try harder. What did I do wrong? How can I get them back? What can I do? I don't want them to leave, right? And so the cycle begins. As soon as we turn around and stop being angry that they're doing this and start to go, oh, but I want them back. I'll try harder. I'll try harder. That goes into love bombing. Now that they've won and they get us back into this like lovely, nice, calm, the person you married. And then it starts again. It just keeps going around and around.
So you mentioned too a term that I'd like a little explanation for our listeners on, and that is gaslighting. What exactly is gaslighting? Because I know it's something that narcissists do all the time. What is it?
Well, a lot of people think it's a lie, but narcissists are famous for lying. It's not really a lie. It is a lie with the intent to confuse you, to distort reality, and to make you feel like you've done something wrong. So, in divorce, I have a whole chapter in my book on how narcissists use gaslighting in a divorce. So they can start this gaslighting all along if you start to talk about the divorce. There's no money. You'll get nothing if you divorce me. I'm the breadwinner. You'll move out of this house. You'll never get the kids. Just these sort of things come, and that's gaslighting. That's where they are trying to scare you with this lie into staying. Well, if I'm not going to get any money, I have no choice. I was the stay-at-home mom. I don't have the means to do this. And they're going to take my kids away. That's part of the, okay, I've got to fight back. And they hook you back because you see the gaslighting is convincing you have no other alternatives but to stay and acquiesce to this kind of abuse.
Yeah. So how do people identify gaslighting or deal with it and get out of it? Because you really believe the nonsense that you're being fed, right? So what would you say to somebody who is believing the BS, so to speak? How do you break the cycle?
Well, you break it with the truth.
Now we're going to hear from Kathleen Brigham. Kathleen is a mediator and the creator of Brigham Advising. And after going through her own divorce and finding it difficult to map a productive path between tough talking lawyers, well meaning therapists, and supportive but uneasy friends and family, Kathleen's advising is designed to be a catalyst to creating a personal divorce plan, with or without nesting, and to accelerate the path to resolution and peace. And Kathy is going to talk about bird nesting. I am excited to have you because you and your husband, when you went through your divorce, did something a little bit, no, a lot of bit unusual, right? And this is
Very.
something that the divorce professionals we talk about in our world, but most people don't do it. And that's something called bird nesting. So if you could, just to start, explain to the listeners what is nesting or bird nesting, what does it mean, and why did you do it?
Okay. So yes, a lot of people refer to it as bird nesting. Now the term sort of dropping the bird and going over to nesting, but essentially what it means is that the children of the couple that is going through the separation or divorce stay in one place. They stay in one home, and the exes or soon to be exes come and go. And that can look very different. It can be a house that's owned by one and the other comes and goes. It might be a joint home, but the basic premise behind it is that the children are not moving from home to home, right? From their dads to their moms and back and forth, but that they have this solid, stable home, and the exes are figuring out what that's all about and how they're going to share that space.
Okay, so this immediately brings up a host of questions for me. So if I'm understanding this right, let's say that we're talking about a couple that's just starting a divorce process, right? So they've all lived in one home together. And so the idea is that home becomes the children's home, and the husband and wife go in and out on a set schedule. Is that right?
That is right. That is right. And you're right that usually they have a home, right? That you have a family unit, mother, father, children, usually. And so when they're going through that separation, you figure out who's going to keep that home. And that's a whole nother conversation. But that is the place where the children are going to stay.
So when the spouses are going in and out of this home, the children's home, when they're not in the children's home, where are they? Do they each have their own apartments? Do you have one apartment and share that so you're always in shared space? How does that work?
Really good question. What I would say is there's a whole spectrum here of how sort of, in many people's view, how crazy this can get, right? So I'm just going to give you my example, and then I'll throw in some others examples of people that I've worked with. So my example is that I had the home, and my soon-to-be ex found his own small apartment. Now, at the time, we were in New York City, pretty pricey real estate. So this can often be a financial decision. There's no way that we're both going to have, 3-4 bedroom apartments or something like that. So he got a smaller apartment, and that was his. When I left on my not children nights, I did not go to his apartment. Okay. I went, and we can talk about where I went, and it was sometimes, difficult or with a friend or different things, but I was not going to go live, in his apartment. I will tell you, there are situations where the soon-to-be exes decide on a sort of a shared apartment, and they do that. That was extreme for me. I did not want to do that. I was willing to leave the home and let my ex-husband come in and be with the children. But when I left, I decided where I wanted to go.
So it sounds like what you did was you would stay with friends or family or so you never really had your own space.
Yeah. So it was tricky in the beginning because, it's like, can you carry your suitcase to your friends or your sisters? I was really fortunate to have access to a New York City apartment through some very nice people that they were not using. So I could go there. So I kind of did have that place. But it took all different, and I moved around quite a bit. We didn't stay in the city the whole time, and I eventually moved to the suburbs. But the point is, it can be tricky, right? I think the whole premise of this bird nesting is it is uncomfortable. It is going to be uncomfortable.
And why is it that you made that decision? Because you could have also, if your husband had his own little apartment, I mean, you could have also made the more traditional, typical choice of you stay in the home with the kids, and then when he's got them on his parenting time, either they go somewhere else or they all camp in the living room, or they, whatever that looks like, that they're with him when they're with him, and they're with you and they're with you. Why make the choice that you made?
So when I was going through this, my children were quite young. Okay. The youngest was 4. And I have 3 children altogether. So they were between the sort of the ages of 4 and 12 and 13. And what I was seeing is that this was chaos. I mean, just having a family at this time, right? How many different activities do you have? Where's the homework? Where's the soccer uniform? All this kind of thing. And to be perfectly honest, it was a way of me keeping some control. I knew that if they were in this home, everything was there. They weren't going to forget their homework when they went to their dad's. Their dad wasn't going to not know where the soccer uniform was, things like that. So initially, I sort of had this gut feeling that I want to keep these kids in a very comfortable and safe and stable environment. So that's where it stemmed. It really did stem from. I had friends that had been had gone through a divorce. I had seen sort of the sad little suitcases being packed and going down the street. And I just really didn't want that. And I'll be honest, it was a way of protecting, and we can talk about whether or not that's always a good thing or not, but it was a way of protecting my children from really kind of always understanding exactly what was going on. Oh, mom's here, dad's here, but I'm still here. I still have my toys and my stuffed animal. My friend can come over and I know that schedule. It's not like, are you your dad's tonight? Are you your mom's? Like, we could have play dates. We could organize all of this, and it was all in one place.
But that still takes organization, right? So you must have had like some sort of a family calendar, because, like, for example, if you're organizing that play date for tomorrow, but you're not the parent that's going to be there tomorrow, you've got to make sure that your spouse knows that he's okay with it, that he knows what his responsibilities are, what he's walking into when he's walking in the door, and what you're walking out at. Like, there's still a lot of coordination, I would think.
An enormous amount of coordination. But if you think about it, there's even more coordination if I'm the one saying, hey, tomorrow night is dad's night, get your bag packed, where's your uniform, where's your ballet shoes, things like that. That also takes an enormous amount of coordination. And I think a lot of this, people would say, wow, you're really a pushover, or you're really doing a lot for your ex-husband. I don't really understand it. And I kept saying, I'm not. I'm actually just doing a lot for my kids. I really am just keeping them focused. I have a shared Google Calendar. I would literally leave a very long text for my ex saying, hey, this is what's homework, this kind of thing. Here's the night unfolding. I'm out. I wouldn't always have conversations. I don't think you need to get on the phone and do that. It could be a shared Google Calendar. It could be just a whiteboard with, here are the things, the highlights of the night, whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is, in a divorce, normally it's not equal, right? There's usually one who is doing the caretaking more than the other. And no matter if you're living together or living apart or moving the kids back and forth from 2 homes, there's someone who has to be the coordinator. And that was me.
Yeah. So tell me about, if you don't mind sharing, what was your schedule like? How many nights a week were you in the house? How many nights a week was he in the house?
Yeah, good question. So in a traditional divorce, you often get the Wednesday night and then the every other weekend sort of situation. Our kids were really, really young, as I had mentioned. So I suggested to our mediator that we have the Wednesday night, but that in the very beginning, we split the weekends. So Friday night with dad, Saturday night with mom, the next weekend, Friday night with mom, Saturday night with dad. It gets tricky, and I'm not sure that was really necessary, maybe, but I thought at the time they were so young that a weekend was a really long time away from a parent. So that's just what we did for a while, and then it morphed into the every other weekend. But if you can just imagine a Wednesday, and I had a much more flexible work schedule at the time, so I was the one sort of doing the school pickup and things like that. So I would get them in place on a Wednesday, get them started on their homework. For a while, we had a shared babysitter, and I think this was the real saving moment for me. I would have that babysitter stick around for that transition time, that 15, 20 minutes, and I'd head out. I'd say goodbye to the kids. They're all set. I'd give our sitter sort of the plans, and then I would leave because look, I'm not a robot. I didn't need to have that interaction every time he, was coming into my house. So there are things that I set up to make it a little easier on myself. And I would do the same for the times where he came in on the weekends. And let's just be clear, because people always say this, like, where is this person sleeping? This sounds crazy. No, he's not. I'm not coming into my bedroom. He's not sleeping in my bed. He's downstairs with the kids, honestly camping out with them most of the time. My current husband, did the same with his family, which is when we met, was such an interesting point of connection for us. And they had like a guest, sort of room down in the basement. So he would go into his ex-wife's home and be in the basement. So they're all sort of different versions.
In the next segment, we're going to talk with Michael Cohen. Michael is a former corporate executive who went through a litigated divorce and vowed to transition his career to divorce mediation as a result. Michael has his CPA and is very adept at helping couples with the financial decisions that they need to make during and after their divorce, but his passion is working with parents and helping them to divorce while building a strong co-parenting relationship. I think you're really going to enjoy this next segment with Michael Cohen. What would you expect or counsel for co-parents, for people who are coming to divorce, they've got kids, they're thinking of mediating? What would you say to them?
Well, a lot of people come to mediation and they think their most valuable assets are their house, their retirement accounts, etc. But their most valuable asset is their children. And how they divorce is how their children are affected by divorce. I've seen it. My daughter was alienated from me. My boys are great, but they both went through a hard time in the middle of a divorce. And I've got a lot of life stories that I talk about and how that has affected them and how it has put the stress of my prior marriage and divorce on them. And it breaks my heart that they have to deal with that. So when I talk to parents, I really focus on how do they minimize the impact of divorce on their children. So children are divorced, right? When you go through a divorce, it changes a child's perspective. But if parents can do it in a way that's emotionally healthy for their children, it doesn't have to, what I would say, change their life arc. It doesn't have to change their development, their growth as a person. Yes, their story has changed, but they could still grow up to love their parents, feel loved by a family, and feel supported by a family. And that gives children confidence, and it allows them to be successful. When parents are going through a litigated divorce, it takes a long time. There's a lot of contention. The parents aren't talking to each other because their lawyers generally say, don't talk to each other about the divorce. So the kids feel it, and kids are so smart. Not only do they see things, they hear things, and they feel emotions. And when a litigated divorce takes a year and a half, 2 years, kids go through that and they're affected. So my goal is to try to get them to get to an amicable decision quicker while talking to each other and learning how to communicate with each other so that their kids not only hear them say they both love them, but they feel that and they trust that.
So what would you say to the divorcing couple? They come and they're not totally sold on mediation, but they've heard it's a way to save time and money. So they're sitting in front of you, or maybe they're deciding whether to sit in front of you, and they say, look, we can't even agree on what time of day it is. How are we going to mediate?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, if you could picture whoever we're talking to, your listeners right now, they're in a situation where they have conflict with somebody. That conflict is high, it's real, it's very abrasive sometimes. You introduce a third party into the conversation, and all of a sudden they're watching their P's and Q's a little bit, and they're both explaining their logic a little different. And that person in the middle now is translating what one person is saying so that the other person could hear it, and the temperature comes down. So I've seen people who have contention. When you introduce a third party who's unbiased and will reframe the conversation and help them listen to each other, it really brings the temperature down, and it does work. It's not easy. Some clients are easier than others, But it can get done. And the third party, who's a neutral facilitator, does a tremendous job to get the conversation going.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that just by having another person in the room, sitting there and listening to the conversation changes. Am I getting that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, it's like a buffer, like the mediator becomes the buffer. The mediator has to have thick skin, has to have patience because they absorb the hits, right?
Yep.
And I've seen it. Sometimes it takes a session or two before the clients get to a point where they start to listen and work together as a unit. But in the meantime, the mediator has to take the stress, absorb it, and kind of spit out something that's more amicable so that the conversation can be productive.
A question that I have gotten a lot of times from, my listeners and my readers is, how do I know if mediation is going to work for me? Like, how do I know if I even invest in mediation? What would you say to that? How can somebody tell? Because there are some cases where it's just not appropriate for mediation. How can you, as a person who's not familiar with the system, who's not familiar with mediation, how do you know if your case is an appropriate case for mediation or not?
Good question. So, like at a bare minimum, both spouses have to agree to mediate. So you can't force mediation on somebody. So what I do is have consultations with each spouse, make sure they both understand the process, make sure they understand they can have their questions answered. But what I tell them both ultimately is there's really no risk to trying to mediate. Most lawyers will charge a retainer, and that retainer isn't refundable, and it's pretty sizable, and both parties need a lawyer. So let's call it $3,000 to $5,000 each. You're in for $6,000 to $10,000 before anything happens. You have to replenish it. You'll probably have to replenish it at least once before you even see any progress. So you're in a lot of money and you're committed. When you mediate, and I'm talking for myself, I don't charge a retainer. I know a lot of mediators don't charge a retainer, but it's a pay as you go, and you could stop at any time. So what I always encourage people to do is invest an hour or two, a session or two, and see how it goes. If it's not working right, you could stop. You've wasted very little time. You've wasted very little money. And if you stay long enough and make some agreements, you can actually take those agreements forward to your lawyer and benefit from them and not relitigate them. So it's a very low risk time in terms of time and money endeavor. And I always encourage people to try it because mediation is the healthiest way for families. It's the most economical way for the marital assets. And it's just the healthiest way to divorce. And it's not often that you could spend the least amount of money in the healthiest way and get the best product. So it's worth trying.
Well, what if you get into the situation where people say, my spouse is hiding money? Is that if someone really believes that their spouse is hiding money, is that a case that you can mediate or not?
It's a really good question. I have a client right now who's asking me those questions. One of the caveats with mediation is both parties have to be transparent. Now, I have a CPA, so I do a lot of tick and tying around the documents and the financials that they present, but that's not foolproof. So if somebody has a separate account, there's really no way for me to know that without doing some work. Now, you could bring in a forensic accountant, but that's very costly. There's some guides that are out there that each individual could look at to try to do before they start the process. But I mean, mediators might think differently. I generally tell people if there's lack of trust, you might need more of a legal representation to get records and to dig deeper. But I like to give it a try. I know the questions to ask during the financial review, and sometimes that surfaces things that people might have just made a mistake and haven't mentioned. If there's truly deceit going on, that's hard. I don't know. Do you have a different opinion on that? I know you've got some experience as well.
Yeah. Oh, just a little bit. But yeah, mediation only works if people are going to come to the table and be transparent. However, there are ways, like you said, there are questions that you can ask when you've been around the block a timer 500. And you can start to suss out information and see, are both parties providing accurate information. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes people forget. It's like, oh yeah, I had that, retirement account from when I was at this job like 20 years ago. And I haven't, like, people legitimately forget things sometimes. And then they not legitimately forget things other times. So it's about figuring out what boat that you're in. And that's one of the factors that you've got to think about when you're choosing mediation. But I have a question for you, though. I mean, people think of, okay, mediation is an alternative to litigation. I'm going to go to the mediator first, and then if it doesn't work, we have to litigate. But what happens? I mean, is it possible for a couple to start in litigation so that they've got the benefit of a court-ordered discovery process? They can issue subpoenas, they can get the information they're missing, and then once they have what they believe to be full financial information, can they then go to mediation?
They can. And certainly in Illinois and in most states, you're required to mediate your parenting section. So for certain, while you're litigating, no judge is going to want to make decisions for your family. They're going to want you to try it. So that part can come out and be mediated, and it should be. As far as the financial aspects, they certainly can. I think emotions change as you go through a divorce process. And originally, I think everybody knows you just file and hire a lawyer and you go down the path, and then you start paying the bills. And then you start realizing I'm spending a lot of money and we're not making any progress. And God, we just want to get this over with. And we know it's fair. You could certainly take that out of the lawyer's hands, come to a mediator and resolve that. And then the mediator would provide your lawyer with an MOU that they could then use and leverage to finalize your divorce.
What is an MOU?
Oh, sorry. I thought I was talking to you.
Yeah, you are talking to me, but everybody else might not understand.
So an MOU is the product that a mediator provides the couple. It's called a memorandum of understanding. It basically summarizes what the couple agreed to. It's not binding until it's filed in court and approved by a judge, but it provides a basis for a lawyer to draft the final papers and get you in front of a judge.
Now we're going to hear from Janelle Orion. Janelle is an Ivy League educated personal growth junkie, entrepreneur, and pleasure activator. With her open heart and radical acceptance, Janelle coaches people to feel wildly alive and gives you permission to live one step closer to your truth. And in this segment, we're going to talk about how to navigate a sexless marriage.
What happened was, we have this idea of like, okay, well, I had this idea. We're going to get married and we're adults and we can communicate and we can problem solve and we're smart and we're creative. And so whatever problems we have, we're going to be able to solve. But then shortly after we got married, my husband just stopped desiring to have sex with me.
Why?
That's the question, Karen, that ultimately I don't know that we'll ever have a full answer to. But ultimately it was, this is what's here and how do we figure this out? How do we try to fix, if you will, this part of our relationship, right? Because we still were in love and had fun and traveled and did all these things. But it was hard. It was confusing. There was shame. There was hurt. Neither one of us understood what was going on. So we tried everything we could to figure out how to resolve that. And so starting with talk therapy, and then we both got introduced to Tantra and did this deep dive into personal growth and learning skills around pleasure and intimacy, and like asking ourselves questions like, what is it that I want versus what society's told me that I want?
That's so important because, all right, first of all, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about this, because so many people have issues around sex. For so many couples, sex, maybe it starts out great and maybe not right in the beginning of the marriage, but ultimately it tapers off at some point, usually after they have kids, usually after they're tired. And sex becomes this big elephant in the room, or in the relationship rather. And because there's guilt, because there's shame, no one wants to talk about it. No one knows how to talk about it. And no one certainly knows what to do about it. So,
Mhm.
you said you started with talk therapy. How did you find a therapist? Did you go to a regular talk therapist, or did you have to find a sex therapist? Or like, if someone's got this problem, what do they do?
Well, I'll say one of the things that we did was because I mentioned we converted from monogamy when we first met as we were dating into a non-monogamous relationship. Um, we had a sex therapist, right? Someone who was open to non-traditional relationship types. And we had that when things were fine, but as a tool in our toolbox, because we knew for both of us that we were swimming in waters that were new for us, that we were expanding ourselves, but we were also playing with our edges. And so this is one of the ways that my husband was very smart. He's like, we should just like, what are the resources we have available to us to help us navigate this well?
Wow, that is a really great idea. But all right, now I have to ask you, and I apologize if this is an inappropriate question, but I would think as somebody who is not polyamorous, I mean, very, very traditional marriage, for myself and my husband, that's our choice. But a lot of people are probably wondering, okay, you could have sex with anybody you wanted. You were polyamorous.
Mhm.
What difference did it make that you and your husband weren't having sex?
That's a great question, actually. I'm so glad that you're asking it because that was part of my journey. I didn't understand why that was the case. And part of it was that I wasn't having actually a ton of sex. I was having some, but I was so engrossed in trying to understand what was happening with our relationship that I wasn't like, oh, let me go and figure out another relationship. Someone else could have, no problem. We did, and I did try to say, okay, for a long time, I'm just not going to have sex with my primary partner, my husband. I can have other relationships. But ultimately, what ended up happening is I found my truth, which was that I wanted to be having sex with my primary partner.
How did you find that truth? How did that realization come to you?
It was a long journey. It was over the many years, and the journey was a painful one. And when I say like coming home to myself, it's not an easy journey for people, for anyone to like look in the mirror and say, okay, what is it that I want? What I've been taught? What am I where? And what I came to realize was that I was honoring my husband's boundaries, but I was actually crossing my own but I didn't even know what my boundary was. Like I didn't know that wanting to have sex with a primary partner was my boundary until I finally, after retreats and reading and therapy and dark nights of the soul, that I was like, oh, this is what I want. And it's not here. And so the repercussion of standing in my truth meant we need to talk about divorce.
Well, I assume that before you got to that point, you tried a lot of things. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
and I also assume because it seems like you're a very sexual being, as we all are, but a lot of people don't express it that well. Um, you must have been having sex with them before you were married.
Yes, we
What
were. And
okay,
it was
okay,
great
I'm
sex.
confused.
So I think that the example, or I'm just an example of the complexity of being human and of being in relationships, right? We all have things that we bring into a relationship. And there's stuff that some of us we don't ever figure out. And there's We Can Do Hard Things is a podcast with Glennon Doyle. And her sister mentions on this podcast that, there's an assumption that it's men who want the sex and women who don't. And that's like the
Mhm.
thing, the meme in our culture. And so there's an added shame when it's the woman who wants sex and the man doesn't, because then it feels like, oh, there's doubly something wrong with me because I want it. So that possibly makes me bad, shameful, something, woman doing something she shouldn't. And yet, why? And then he doesn't want me. So something must be wrong with me. Right. So these were all things that I was having to navigate and figure out on my own, like, or not on my own, but that's my own journey
Mhm.
to be like, oh, nothing's actually wrong with me. But I'll also say, yes, a sexual being, but I have become much more sexual and like radiant and embodied in my sexuality as a result of this journey. I mentioned that I was taking courses on pleasure and tantra and intimacy. So I actually learned, where was I actually not expressing my desires? Where was I being out of consent and out of alignment with my desires, and then speaking and then my actions? Um, I feel that there are so many just basic skills in the areas of pleasure, intimacy, and consent that we are not taught, that we could be taught starting in high school for like basic relating. And that's what I learned as
I
a
was
result of this journey.
wondering that as you were talking, it was occurring to me, like, do the skills that you learned in the area of pleasure and intimacy, will those skills transfer into just talking to your spouse or being in a relationship and having boundaries? Is there a transference of these skills?
Yes, 100%. In fact, I would say like sex is actually just the byproduct. Like it's almost not the thing, right? The thing is, how do we talk about it? Something that's vulnerable, that's intimate, that may be tinged with guilt or shame or confusion, something that can activate us into anger, frustration, tears, and hurt. How do you have a conversation about those things? Because oftentimes having the conversation is what can cause a greater disconnection, because someone's not feeling heard or not feeling seen.
So how do you do that? Because you have just like honed right in on the problem that so many people have. And you're right, it's not, the sex is almost a symptom of the problem. The problem
Mm-hmm.
comes down to communication, but communication about an issue that's so close to home and so sensitive that that makes it even more challenging. So if somebody found themselves in the same position as you, regardless of what kind of a relationship it was, but it was one where they had someone they identified as a partner and they wanted intimacy with them, and there were problems with that intimacy portion of their relationship, what tips do you have for how can you have this conversation?
Well, I'm actually really glad you asked, because I'm actually writing a book on this very topic.
Oh, hey.
And um, what I call what you're asking is leading an epic life. Epic being embodying pleasure, intimacy, and consent as a path towards freedom and more fulfilling relationships. And so for me, there are skills around pleasure. And pleasure is a relationship with ourselves. What is it that we desire? And the question often that people don't ask, but I believe is really important, is what makes me feel safe in my body? Because when I feel safe in my body, then my pleasure gets more activated and I can be more curious.
We're going to wrap up today's episode with a conversation with another high conflict divorce coach, Karen McMahon. And Karen's signature approach addresses the internal intricacies of intense emotions, fixed mindsets, and unconscious behaviors, along with the external complexities of legal approaches, financial awareness, and co-parenting hurdles, ensuring that her clients emerge both victorious and transformed. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Karen McMahon.
I've heard so many heartbreaking stories over the years, and mine was one of them. I was in a short marriage. We were married maybe 10 years before I started, or even 8 years before I started working on our divorce. And so my ex-husband had anger management issues. The words that were spoken to me were so mean and nasty and hurtful. I couldn't shower hot enough or long enough to like get it off. My divorce was 3.5 years. My children were 4 and 6 when I told them I am leaving daddy. I took full responsibility because I knew I'd get thrown out under the bus. CPS was involved 4 times. The police came to the house. There was an order of protection. I was a fully commissioned salesperson. I was a working mom, and I lost all of my business because I was emotionally devastated. I had my one and only panic attack where I thought I was having a heart attack. And I lived in the attic for 3.5 years, and it was a hellacious journey that was also the most transformative gift of my life.
I mean, obviously that sounds like a conflict in terms, hellacious experience and a transformative gift. How did you get to the place where you could look at the worst experience of your life and see that it was really a gift?
Yeah, emerging from it, and we on our Journey Beyond Divorce podcast, we have a series called Voices of Celebration, which are all of our clients over the years who entered like me, resistant, scared, thinking it was the worst thing in the world, and emerged feeling renewed and transformed. And so when I emerged from my divorce in 2006, when I finally left the attic and had my own place, I remember calling my best friend and saying, I am so pleased with the human being I have become that if someone said I had to do it all over again to be where I am today, I would do it on a dime.
Wow,
And
that's amazing.
I have a business partner, Lisa Brick, and she was raised in a conscious household. So consciousness, intentionality was her life. I was a fairly sleepwalking individual until I slammed into my broken marriage and really began doing the work. For me, one of the biggest gifts was I went to Al-Anon. And Al-Anon is all about keep the focus on yourself. Like, don't clean their side of the street, don't cross to their side of the street. You focus on you, you do you. And that's one of the foundational tenets of Journey Beyond Divorce, but it was such a gift because it's so easy when your spouse is high conflict, it is so easy to be like he this and she that, and like you can sing their shortcomings, right, and their faults until the cows come home. And how many people, and I'll say this and then stop, there's the divorce rate is higher in second and third marriages because so many people think I've divorced the problem, I'll get on with my life, and then they rinse and repeat, and then they say, why does this keep happening to me? When in fact, they didn't do the work to make sure that they found someone different. So they ended up with the same person in a different body.
Yeah, that is so true. You and I have both seen it many, many times. And yet it's really hard when you're in a situation that is abusive to you to focus on your own side of the street and not on what's being done to you, right? How do you help people change their mindset around it's being done to me versus it's being done for me, or I'll work with what's being done to me and make it something different?
Yeah, it's not an either or. It's a yes and. Yes, you're experiencing abuse. Yes, their behavior is displeasing. It is unacceptable. Yes, yes, yes. And let's look at what you brought to the table, because healthy people don't end up in relationships with high conflict individuals. Unhealthy individuals end up in relationship with high conflict individuals. So the high conflict individual, and this is the other thing I like to say is, like, in today's day and age, everyone's an evil narcissist. And I don't play that game. High conflict individuals have mental health issues, and they have trauma. And so there's all types of neurodiversity going on. And so whether you're a narcissist or you have borderline personality, bipolar, OCD, 100 other things, the human beings in this world who have mental illness are not the evil scourge of the world. They may be displeasing to be in intimate relationship with, and that's where boundaries come in. And what I encourage my clients is when they come to us, they usually feel understandably out of control. Divorce is out of my control. Everything's out of my control. He or she is out of my control. And we get to say, actually, there's something in your control that's a game changer. Would you like to know what it is? And would you like to focus on it? Because you can feel uber empowered going through your divorce if you focus on this thing that's in your control. What is it? It's you.
Yeah. And I think if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the things that is part of you or not part of you are boundaries, right? And for people who are in those relationships with a high conflict person, oftentimes boundaries are one of their biggest challenges because, as you mentioned, they're codependent. So if you could share with the audience a little bit about what boundaries are and why they're such a problem in a high conflict relationship.
Yeah, and before I get into that, I do want to say, as you're listening to this episode, I want you to put on like a helmet of self-compassion and gentle kindness toward yourself. Because even as I say, like, we were wounded coming in, whether you resonate with being codependent or a people pleaser or a perfectionist, these are coping mechanisms that we created as children in our family. And most families have some dysfunction. Mine was an alcoholic dad and a rageaholic mom, and very, very young, right? So like when I think of how young they were, it's like scary that they had 3 people that they were raising. But we don't lick it off the grass. We don't make it up. It's not our fault. We learn coping mechanisms to be in these dysfunctional families. And then as we become adults, the very coping mechanisms that protected us, that created our codependence and our people pleasing, protected us. We intuitively, as children, knew how to protect ourselves. Those same coping mechanisms are going to lead you into dysfunctional, unhealthy relationships. We need to shed that armor and create healthy coping mechanisms. And boundaries, I guarantee you, I've yet to meet a client who wasn't good at boundaries, who grew up in a household with boundaries. It's like if you can't play a musical instrument because you didn't grow up with one, that makes sense. If you didn't grow up with boundaries, you're not going to understand what they are, what the value of them are, or how to use the skill of boundaries in a valuable way.
So what could you share with our listeners if they think, well, first of all, let's dial this back a little bit and say, let's say you're in a high conflict marriage, a high conflict divorce, a high conflict co-parenting situation, whatever it is, there is a lot of conflict. How can you identify whether or not you have a boundary issue?
How can you identify if you have a boundary issue?
Yeah, what if there's somebody
Beautiful.
listening that says, I don't know if this is me or not? What would you say? How can they figure it out?
Right. So the idea of a boundary is there's internal boundaries that aren't often spoken about. And so if you're trying to control your displeasing spouse, you have a boundary issue because you're right there. You've got a boundary issue. If you find that you need protection from your spouse because of their verbal, physical, emotional, financial control, you have a boundary issue. And if you are sitting there and you're going, I have told her not to do this. I have told him that I don't like that. And they just don't listen. You have a boundary issue, right? And you just don't know. You're getting there, but you don't know. And so boundaries are this 2-step dance. You set a boundary and you uphold a boundary. So let's talk about the internal boundary first, because I think that this is so fundamental to every relationship we're in, Karen. So how often do you hear someone say, you make me feel?
All the time.
Well, I only did that because you did that thing. You made me do it. Unless someone has a gun to your head, nobody makes you feel, nobody makes you do. You feel what you feel and you do what you do, but to own that, like that's the first part. And I get pushback all the time. It's like when he said X, Y, and Z to me, he absolutely made me feel unworthy. Well, no, he didn't, because he could say the same XYZ to someone who grew up in a healthy household, who has strong self-esteem, and that person would go, wow, that's nasty. Either you're having a bad day or this is the way you behave, but either way, it's unacceptable to me. And they wouldn't feel anything. They wouldn't be devastated or hurt. And so our feelings come from our life history and how we navigated things. And again, that family of origin. And so on a very fundamental level, talk about empowerment. When you can say, nobody makes me feel and nobody makes me do. I have full and complete agency over my emotions and my behavior. We are already in a new neighborhood. We are already in, we are building self-confidence, self-esteem, certainty of ourselves. Like, that's a beautiful thing.
I really hope you've enjoyed this special episode of the Off the Fence podcast, sharing the best of the interviews that we had in 2024. If you like this episode, if you want to see more episodes in 2025, I highly encourage you, like this episode, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It makes all the difference in the world. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.